know that it promotes personal empowerment and social respect.
It completely promotes divisiveness.
Welcome to another episode of Hear Both Sides. I'm Michael.
And I'm Nina, and we're your hosts.
Hear Both Sides is a platform that was developed to give people a chance to really develop informed opinions about hot topics happening in our world. Instead of just making an opinion based on the latest Facebook feed or what your bubble of friends tell you to believe or think, Hear Both Sides gives you a chance to hear both sides, both perspectives, to make intelligent, informed decisions. So the goal is 2 speakers, 6 questions, 12 minutes, and you are now an informed citizen.
So decide to listen and listen to decide.
We are pleased to have with us today David Rosas. David is a first-generation bilingual, queer-identified, Indigenous native New Yorker from Hell's Kitchen, pre-gentrification. He's been an educator for 21 years and has worked as a teacher in grade K-7, an instructional coach, a principal in elementary schools. And David is now an assistant principal at the Castle Bridge School in Washington Heights.
And on the other side, we have Shelly Newman. She's a proud mother of 2 and has worked in education for over 30 years as a principal, dean of student life, classroom teacher, and librarian. She has graduate degrees in education history and is a certified archivist, reading specialist, and level 1 cognitive behavioral therapist.
So we're looking forward to getting into this very juicy issue, very hot issue today of critical race theory. I want to start with just the basics. Let's start by asking the question, how would you describe critical race theory?
Critical race theory, from my perspective, it's a theory, it's a big idea, it's a guiding idea that helps us analyze systemic racism. It focuses on 5 different themes or tenets that help develop this understanding. It also helps us understand how we can dismantle and challenge systemic racism in whatever space we occupy.
Critical race theory is a theory, and basically it posits that the whole framework of Western civilization is infused with racism. In other words, racism is everywhere. Proponents of critical race theory believe that certain racial groups, specifically white people, have benefited from this racism-based framework, and that consciously or unconsciously, they oppress people of color in order to maintain that privilege.
Do you believe that systemic racism at a state or federal level exists? And what are the facts or statistics to support your position?
So I do not believe that systemic racism exists on a state or federal level. It's actually against the law. You are not allowed to discriminate based on any immutable traits. But CRT proponents have kind of redefined systemic racism to mean that if there are unequal outcomes by race, it must be only because of racial discrimination. If that's the case, how do we explain how so many people of color are so successful? That we had a Black president. And again, by their argument, the NBA is a racist organization because it's racist against white people. So no, I don't believe it exists. And I actually think it's dangerous to say it does.
I do believe that it exists at all those levels, and I would say in others. What I can offer is what I've lived and what I understand, right? And so for me, systemic racism is what water is to fish. It's just all around us all the time. Again, as a racialized person, and this is actually one of the tenets in critical race theory, is that there is this centrality of experiential knowledge, right? So I have lived many instances of systemic racism, thinking about as a younger person being racially profiled by police officers, thinking about as an adult, whenever I've driven through certain neighborhoods, being questioned by police as to what my intentions are in those neighborhoods.
What are your thoughts on parents as stakeholders in their children's curriculum? How do we resolve the conflict between the parent's vision versus an educator's vision for children?
This is a tough one, Michael. I think, as an educator, I want to make sure that families always have a space in the school to be able to share their thoughts, questions, concerns, perspectives. But I also want there to be space for the educators who we are trained to teach kids in elementary schools how to read, write, and mathematize, right? And so I also want to be trusted in that I've done this for over 21 years. I know how to get your kids there. And so I want to be able to get to this place where we can trust each other and reach that common vision, that common goal of education as a social endeavor, and not necessarily something that's narrowed down to just one perspective.
Have you yourself had any kind of direct conflict with parents who disagree with your methodologies or the messaging that comes in your classes?
I think in the past, I want to say in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, where there was an apprehension and a questioning about like, why aren't you just teaching, regular history, right? Talking about George Washington and the cherry tree. My pushback has always been, what worked for us, and I include myself in that, what worked for us was specific to that time, right? To the late 20th century. But now thinking about, in the early 2000s, we're entering the 21st century. We've got to do new things, right? And so we have an opportunity to question and to wonder about what really took place from different perspectives throughout history.
I think it's actually quite simple. Teachers are there to teach skills. Teachers are there to teach basic common values. Teachers are not there to teach ideology. That's the role of a parent, not necessarily to teach ideology, but to raise their child in the way that they feel comfortable with their values. And so what CRT does is it says, no, we're teaching skills, and just as equally, we're going to teach what we believe in our ideology, even if it contradicts with what's being taught at home.
Does CRT promote personal empowerment and social tolerance, or victimhood and social divisiveness?
It completely promotes divisiveness. I don't see how it could be any different. It really devalues and dismisses the individual and individual agency. It sort of makes you have to identify with a group. You are your identity markers, which is pretty simplistic. And again, CRT also says that you're either in a group that's oppressed or you're an oppressor, you're a victim or a perpetrator. So the individual just completely disappears. And when the individual disappears and people are just in groups, then of course it's divisive.
I know that it promotes personal empowerment and social respect. It promotes the idea that there's more to a reality than one based in white supremacist thought and reasoning. It promotes ideas that folks who have been racialized and marked as being other than white have a lived reality that has space and validity in our world.
Have you seen examples of where people could, let's say, maybe take it too far and it becomes an issue of, I'm a victim, so therefore I'm more entitled than everybody else, in a way that's not really it's kind of out of balance?
I think, everyone has their own journey across their own racial identity development, and I would include white identified folks in that journey,
Sure.
right? And so, of course, there's times where folks will feel like I am, the victim, and that's my narrative, that's my story, and you can't move me from there. And then there's moments where people are in the space of, I'm constantly oppressed, and here are the oppressors, right? And again, validity to both narratives, right? I think there has to be space though for folks to be able to grow and be able to move back and forth if needed, right? So move forward into a different space. And if you need to go back to the narrative of I've lived a victimized life, then go to that space, but allow yourself to go out of that space as well, right?
Question is, should critical race theory be taught in schools as fact, as theory, or not at all, and why?
So first off, I think critical race theory is not something that you teach as theory, as a direct material in elementary schools. It's just, this is something that you're doing at the graduate level. But there is the analysis that comes from it, right? That has already been informing education for decades, right? And so there's a number of theorists who have been working with these ideas in education, in teacher education, right? And so it's already been happening. But again, the idea that critical race theory itself is being taught to 5 to 10-year-olds, that doesn't make sense. The ideas and the guidance that we get from critical race theory is something that has already been imbued and embedded into work in K-5 schooling.
Okay, well, it is a theory. It should definitely not be taught as fact. It should definitely not be taught at all. Teachers don't have the right to make children feel either oppressed or as oppressors. All children should be given the benefit of the doubt and seen as individuals who can change the world, who have every opportunity, who can overcome things.
Give like a quick example from just an experience you've seen as a teacher in this, like in a school with the kids, like how they react to things or how it creates?
Not only have I seen negative effects, I've seen negative effects specifically about their immutable traits where they question their whiteness, but I've also seen a negative effect in terms of the anxiety that it provokes in children.
From your perspective, what's like the worst case scenario if the CRT proponents really do end up controlling the educational system? Where would it really go to?
Well, I think we've already gotten a little taste of it, because basically what it's done is it's reduced public education. It's lowered the quality of it. It's trying to end civics and debate, and the standards are being lowered. The list is endless. It's already causing division. It politicizes education, which should never happen. And frankly, I don't see it getting any better. I see it getting much worse, creating more division.
I mean, the sad part is that I think there's about 30 states that have already banned it, right? And there's already school board meetings with folks showing up, I want to say armed or ready to, take people down. So unfortunately, if half of our country is in that place already, I'm saying to educators, then we have to get subversive, right? And the work of educators throughout history has been that sometimes we do have to work subversively, right? And sometimes we have to close the classroom door and do what we know is best for the kids or what we know is best for the world at that moment. And no, it's not because I'm high and mighty and I have all these degrees and I know better. It's not that. It's that I'm working within a community and I'm listening and in tune with the kids, the families, and the people in that space at that time. Here's what I've got to do to be able to not necessarily empower, but build up and build with those folks.
Next, we asked Shelly and David to listen to each other's responses. Here's what they had to say.
I am not just a teacher, but also a parent. The future of my children and all children in a free society is deeply threatened when these theories are further embedded in our educational institutions. CRT proponents state that critical race theory is not being taught in schools, only the ideas behind it. Exactly. No one is suggesting that the theory itself is being taught explicitly to children, but teaching the ideas behind it is no less insidious. Stakeholders aren't even aware of what those ideas are. As David suggests, it's clear that some teachers believe that it is their duty and right to move beyond the teaching of skills to the teaching as a social endeavor. In other words, now that the how skills has been covered, parents should trust teachers to teach the what ideology because, and I quote, "We know better." This is not education, this is indoctrination. But most perniciously, because they think they know better, teachers will have to get subversive to combat resistance to CRT. Schools should be teaching kids how to think, not what to think. I'm not denying that racism exists in our world, but I subscribe to the teachings of Martin Luther King Jr., who valued civil liberties and individual character over skin color. CRT proponents like Ibram X. Kendi believe that the only way to correct past racism is with present racism. CRT's anti-racism fix is more racism. How is that a viable solution?
Thank you for the opportunity to be in debate with Shelly and engage in dialogue. I have to start off by noting her use of alarmist language when describing the dangers of critical race theory, which further spreads misinformation and fear around its use in schools and education. I also wholeheartedly disagree with her statement that education should not be politicized, which runs in the face of a politicized history of education. When you think about the access to education that enslaved Black folks had in this country for centuries, they had none. They weren't allowed to learn how to read and write. When you think about Indigenous folks being sent to boarding schools to have their indigeneity stripped away from them, that was politicized education. And all of that was to benefit those folks who identified as white, because politicized education has been set up as a white supremacist institution in this country. I think we need to also lean into Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings' use of educational debt and think about the history of politicized education and how much of its lack of access has impacted the realities and the life opportunities of racialized folks in this country, which is now a debt, an educational debt. And so let's engage in more conversation, and let's see the power of critical race theory in schooling and education. Thank you.
Be sure to share this episode with your friends and your enemies, because it's really easy to take sides when you only know one of them.
So click here or here, click somewhere over here to subscribe and receive notifications.